Welcome back to the show, everybody. I hope you're doing well today. We're doing great here in the Bumblebee Hive, and I hope you're doing excellent. And today we have a really great show. We have an amazing show actually today. You're going to like this one, I know. And we have one of the best speedway riders ever in the sport of speedway. I mean, this guy was the master. So we're talking about really a great rider. And his name is Michael Bast. Do you know Michael Bast? He was amazing. And he's arguably the greatest rider, the greatest speedway rider of all time. Michael Bast, he just was a legend. And he will go down as truly one of the greatest in speedway history. So let's talk about Michael Bast today. This guy was good. This guy was amazing. He was, like I say, one of the greatest riders of all time in the sport of speedway. And Michael Bast, he had a certain young starting of his speedway career.
Mike was born January 6, 1953 in California, and he was raised around motorcycles with his Uncle Harlan Bast. He was racing TT and flat track. And the brothers, the Bast brothers, Mike and Steve, they tagged along and they watched Uncle Harlan race. They tagged along and watched their Uncle Harlan race TT and scrambles. And they started developing a love for motorcycles. At the age of 9 and 10, Mike and Steve, they got their first motorcycle. And they're learning how to shift the bike and how to ride. And by the age of 10, Mike was actually racing. These guys just had it. I mean, they were gifted from God at the beginning. Mike and Steve Bast. Mike and Steve started racing motorcycles at an early age. Mike.
These guys were good, Mike and Steve Bast. And they went ahead and just started winning everything on the speedway scene. And like I say, at the age of 9 and 10, they were actually competing and winning motorcycle races. They learned how to ride a motorcycle at a young age. These guys were good. They were awesome. And they were the Bast brothers. And they were just actually going to be one of the famous riders in speedway. Mike Bast, he actually had an idol when he was a little boy. There was a movie called On Any Sunday. Do you remember the movie On Any Sunday? And his actually idol was in that movie. His name was Dick Bugsley Man. Can you say that word 1,000 times? Dick Bugsley Man. Dick was really a good rider. And he was not a dick. He was a good guy. And also he wanted to emulate Dick Bugsley Man. But as we know in the speedway world that the legendary Mike Bast probably was a lot better than Dick Bugsley Man. So that was just amazing. And by the age of 13, Mike and Steve start racing speedway. They start racing motorcycles and they were winning trophies, TT, flat track. Mike and Steve Bast were just an amazing riders when they were young. And they just had that natural gift, that natural talent from God. And that's kind of what made them so special. So in the early days, Mike and Steve Bast were really good. And these guys actually had a really great beginning of their story. And so actually they just kept winning races. And they were the young guys. And by the age of 13, they saw this poster. It was actually Mike and Steve Bast, they lived like 10 minutes from the Whiteman Stadium. And they were just walking around, I guess, and they saw this poster and they said Speedway at the Whiteman Stadium. And so Mike and Steve, they just thought, oh, wow, let's go. And I guess Uncle Harlan was riding and they said, let's go. Can you ride at this speedway track? And probably Harlan said, yeah, let's go. So Harlan, I guess, start riding at the Whiteman Stadium, and Mike and Steve Bast, they went to go see those races for the first time. And after they saw the races at the Whiteman Stadium, they said to Uncle Harlan and their papa, "Hey, I want to ride." Both Mike and Steve really enjoyed the speedway races at the Whiteman Stadium. So, anyways, they got a speedway bike. They got their first speedway bike, and it was a JAP speedway bike. That was really cool. So Mike and Steve, they got their first bike, and Mike became a speedway rider along with his brother Steve. Here's Mike's speedway bike right there, and that was his JAP. He had that JAP motorcycle, and they actually share that. You had Mike riding the JAP, and then when Mike was done with the race, they would refuel the methanol in the JP, and then Steve would go ahead and ride that JP. And then when Steve got done with the JP, they would fuel it, and Mike would go ahead and ride that JP. So these guys were just, they were good, but his parents just bought one JP, and they shared it by themselves. So that was really good. And these guys just went ahead, and that was the beginning of the Bast brothers. But in the 70s, these guys were good. And also, getting back to the Whiteman Stadium, here's Steve Bast, an early Steve Bast here riding. And look at his uniform. That does not look like the Steve Bast of 1974 when he won the United States Speedway Champion. His last Speedway Championship, he was cool at the Whiteman Stadium. Steve Bast was an amazing guy. And also, here's Mike Bast at the Whiteman Stadium. He was riding actually in the back. You can see Mike. He was a young rider. He wasn't very old at this time, but he was good. Mike was developing, and Steve was just a little bit better at first and a little bit older too, so that helped. But there's Mike just learning how to ride a speedway bike. And here's a couple clippings from the Whiteman program. Mike Bast was in the, probably can't see that. It's probably too small. But here's some clippings of Mike Bast. And Mike Bast was all over the paper at the time at the Whiteman Stadium. They had the team racing, and Steve Bast actually qualified to be on the Red Devils at the Whiteman Stadium. That was pretty cool. And then Mike and Steve, they just kept winning and getting in main events. Actually, by the end of the season, Mike Bast was winning main events. So Mike Bast started like all young riders. He had to develop and learn. That's no big deal because all speedway riders have to start somewhere, right? But Mike Bast had a great story, and we're going to talk about it right now. And he went ahead and became the king of the 70s. Michael Bast won 7 out of 10 United States championships, and that's 70% of the championships in the decade of the 70s. And his older brother, Steve Bast, he won 1 championship in the 70s in 1974. So that was 80% of the Bast brothers winning the championships in the 1970s. That's amazing. And Rick Woods won the other 2. So you had the Bast brothers and Rick Woods winning all the speedway races, all the championship speedway races, the national championships in the 1970s. So it was really amazing that these guys were good. These guys were hot, and we really like what they were doing there.
The Bast brothers decade. Mike Bast, in particular, won 7 out of 10 United States Nationals. That's 70% of the Nationals that Mike won. And his brother Steve won 1 in 74. Another reason to breathe this air. So that was 80% of the Nationals in the 1970s. And the Rocket Rick Wood won 2. So basically it was the Bast brothers and Rick Woods. They completely owned the 1970s.
Those guys were pretty good, I would say. The Bast brothers and Rick Woods, they were complete dominating of the 1970s. They were really great. I mean, these guys were good. They were good riders. And Steve actually, his brother won his first United States Speedway Championship in 1969, the first year of the Costa Mesa Speedway. That was really cool because Steve Bast started racing in 1968, and in 1969 he won his first United States Championship. Only 1 year, and Steve Bast was a United States champion. That is pretty amazing to me. I mean, who can do that? Who can learn how to ride Speedway? And in 1 year, he's a United States Speedway champion. Steve Bast, he could do it. That was just really crazy how he did it. And then Mike went ahead in the 70s and he won 5 United States championships in a row in the mid to latter 70s. I mean, that was just a record that nobody can beat, winning 5 straight United States Speedway Championships in the same decade. That's just crazy.
5 United States National Championships.
Well, something happened there. Live TV is really great, so we're going to have some fun here. We'll see if we can find that video. I think maybe I pushed the wrong button or something. But that wasn't supposed to happen, by the way. That was not supposed to happen. Let's see if we can find that again. Oh, boy. Let's see if we can find that. Here we go. Let's see if we can do this again.
5 United States National Championships in a row after that. A guy from England asked me, why didn't Mike race in England? They're very upset. Over at the pond, they're very angry that the Bast brothers didn't race full-time at the pond. And I said, hey, Mike had a business racing Speedway. He made lots of money in the 70s, and he won a lot. So he was married to his wife, Dee. He didn't need to go over to the pond. He was cleaning up at Costa Mesa and other tracks. Mike was making a great living racing Speedway. And the brother, Steve, he went from buying his first JP and sharing it with his brother Mike in 1968 to 1969, winning the United States National Championship.
That's pretty good. 1 year and you're the national champion. I don't know anyone that can do that except for the Bast brothers. They were just simply amazing, and winning those 5 straight United States Speedway Championships in the 70s, that was pretty incredible. So the Bast brothers, they actually had to learn how to ride Speedway because they were riding the TT style, and they had to have a coach by the name of Ivan Major and Barry Briggs. They actually came and taught these guys and the other guys how to ride a Speedway bike. And everyone needs a coach, right? Every rider needs a coach. And Michael Bast, he needed a coach also in the early days.
Ivan Major and Barry Briggs came over and said, no, you gotta learn how to ride Speedway the right way. Ivan and Barry went ahead and taught Mike how to ride the Speedway bike, and probably Steve too. And they went ahead and were all ears. Everyone needs a coach. I was mentioning to even Bruce Pinhall yesterday that everyone needs a coach, and he said that Mike Bast coached him also. So Mike Bast needed a coach, and Ivan Major was Michael Bast's coach.
Yeah, so everyone needs a coach. We all need to be coached. Nobody is perfect, right? We all have to learn how to ride Speedway bike. And in 1971, Michael Bast won his first Speedway championship. That was his first of 7 in the decade of the 70s. That was just simply amazing. And he just only had 3 years of riding a Speedway bike, and he won his first United States Speedway Championship. Steve did it in like 1 year, 1.5, and Mike did it in like 2 or 3 years. So that's really not bad. So Mike Bast was really on fire, and that was the beginning of the fire. Actually, he had a runoff with Mike Conley, Big Mike Conley. And Mike Conley, number 89, he actually lost that runoff to the master Mike Bast. And that was kind of the end of Mike Conley after he lost that runoff in 1971. And Michael Bast, they tied in points. And Mike Bast won, like I say, that runoff. And that was the beginning of the string of championships for the great master, Michael Bast.
Mike's most exciting year racing Speedway. What? He won his first United States Speedway Championship. He only raced like for 3 years, and he was a United States Speedway champion. His brother Steve only raced like 2 years and was United States Speedway champion. Mike went ahead and beat out Mike Conley. Big Mike Conley, number 89. Mike beat out Mike Conley. Mike beat Mike for the United States Championship in a runoff. In the early 70s, Mike and his brother Steve and a few other American Speedway legends, they went to Australia and New Zealand to do exhibitions and races, and they went ahead and developed their skills on the very long tracks.
Yeah, they were pretty good riders, I would say. And they were taught by the masters, Barry Briggs and Ivan Major. They were just sensational. And Mike would just win like $500 or $1,000 every night at Costa Mesa. I mean, that guy was on fire. And also he won so much money because of the SRA, and they got 30% of the gate. So let's say there was $10 coming in the gate at the Costa Mesa Fairgrounds, which there was a lot of people. It was fully booked. And then Mike and the riders would share 30 or 35% of all the money that came in the gate. Plus, they would win money for every heat race, semi, and scratch and handicap main event. So they were making a lot of money. I mean, this was big time. They were cleaning up. I heard sometimes their guys made $1,500 to $2,000 a night, which is in the Philippines like 100,000 pesos in like 3 hours. So that's not a bad payday in the 1970s. That's just completely amazing. So that was just really cool how Mike won so much money. And he actually didn't race in Europe. Why? Because he made lots of money. Hey, Mike Bast was a smart businessman. I don't know if Mike Bast ever went to college or university, but it didn't matter. Why? Because he was smart and he knew how to make the money. So that's really good. And then actually something happened in 1976. Harry Oxley went ahead and cut the SRA, and he cut the purse money of the 35%, and that created a big change in the Speedway. And that took away the money. Actually, it took away a lot of the money that went to the Speedway riders. And there was a strike, and Mike Bast was actually the head of that strike. So it was just a crazy time. And, it was just, a time that was just, difficult for Speedway. And it changed things a little bit at that time. But before that, Mike actually went ahead and he raced for Team America in Australia. Here's one of the races here when he was racing with his brother Steve, and I think Rick Woods, Bill Cody was there. They were tearing it up over in Australia. They were Team America. Mike Bast was, and his brother and a few other gifted riders were part of the first Team America back in the early 70s. And Mike Bast just became just one of the most amazing Speedway riders in Speedway history. I mean, this guy was good. He had really classic battles with a legend, Rick Woods. And Rick Woods and Mike Bast were arch rivals. They were like two alpha males on the same racetrack together, and they didn't really like each other when they were racing. They kind of rubbed shoulders a little bit, but they were two amazing riders, and they were just super gifted. And the brother Steve, like I said, he won the first Speedway National Championship in 1969, the revival of Speedway. They were good. And then, like I said, in 1971, Mike Bast won his first United States Speedway Championship. I mean, this guy was good. Mike Bast was cooking. And Mike and Steve Bast, they raced together a lot at all the tracks. They raced like 5 nights a week. I mean, it was just really crazy, you know, how much they raced and how much they won. Mike and Steve Bast were living legends. So that was just amazing how these guys really competed. And in the 70s, you had the emergence of Danny Berserko Becker. You have Stevie Nutter there riding, and you have the master Mike Bast was always competing for the championship. So that was just really cool. And then actually, this was the race program when I had my first race at the Costa Mesa Speedway. And there's Rick Woods and Mike Bast on the cover. So that's cool. I always keep that program. Why? Because I was riding my first race. Yeah, again, not against Mike Bast, but I was riding my first race. And Mike Bast was really an amazing talent. He won six California state championships in his career. I mean, that was amazing. And he raced a total of 18 years Speedway. And while he was racing Speedway, he was actually a stuntman. He was a stuntman in the movies. So he was racing Speedway and he was moonlighting as a stuntman in Hollywood. He was the first Hollywood stuntman Speedway rider. And here he is on the set of Freebie and the Bean. And here's, I think Michael Caine is the guy. And he went ahead and he had the stunt double for Michael Caine in that movie. And the producer of the movie, I don't know how they got Michael Bast, but they picked a good writer, that's for sure. And I was reading the article about that. And the producer, they had a trials bike. I don't know if you know what trials bikes are, but they're the bikes that you can kind of like go up mountains with and stuff. They're kind of crazy bikes. And the producer asked Michael Bast, like, you know, do you want us to do a few takes of this trials bike? And Michael Bast said, no, I'm just going to go ahead and go for it. So on the first take, which was really hard, Michael Bast, he actually did this scene in the movie of Freebie and the Bean. I watched that movie in the theater when it came out. And Michael Bast just went over the cars like boom, 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 boom. I was like, oh my God. He actually just went up over cars and over the hood and down and then over the cars. Michael Bast, I mean, he did that on the first take. I cannot believe that he did that. He was a good motorcycle. Michael Bast could ride anything. I mean, Bast was just the best motorcycle rider ever. I mean, he was the legend. And here's the movie producer picture of Freebie and the Bean. And it was just a good movie. And Michael Bast, I actually knew that Michael Bast was in that movie, and I was waiting for Michael Bast to be in that movie. So, and I saw him, I'm like, oh, that's Michael Bast, because I could tell, I know Michael Bast, because I watched him lots of times. And then there's the legendary master when he was making that movie, Freebie and the Bean, and he was just, he was tearing it up. I mean, that guy was winning everything. He was good, Mike Bast, and he was just amazing. And his career as a Hollywood stuntman didn't stop there. He actually was a stuntman in 2 more movies. And let's see, where are we at here? Like in 1979, and he did this movie right here. It's called Cannonball Run. Do you remember Cannonball Run? It was a good movie. And there's a lot of action, a lot of motorcycle stuff. And Michael Bast was a stuntman in Cannonball Run. So he did that one. And then he did another one about Charlie. And here's his last movie. He was a stuntman in that movie. So that was good. And he was just a really great writer. And he was in 3 movies. It was 79 was Fast Charlie's, and in 76 was Cannonball Run. So he was a stuntman in those movies, and he actually did really good. I mean, that guy was amazing. And then in the 70s, they had like riders like his brother Steve Bast losing his back tire, racing at Ventura Raceway. I think this is a classic photo. I mean, here's Steve Bast riding on the rim. That's something that I would do. I would like somehow lose my tire And Steve Bast lost his tire, his rear tire, at the Ventura Fairgrounds. My friends say, I saw that race. I think I saw that race too. I might have been racing at that time. But Steve Bast was an amazing rider, Mike's older brother, and he just had talent that never ended. Mike was a little more focused though, and he was more of a computer brain. But Steve Bast was good, and here's his brother-in-law. That's Lightning Larry Shaw. Can you say Lightning Larry Shaw? We like that guy. He was great, Larry Shaw. And Steve Bast, that was like 75. Steve Bast was wearing those baby blue leathers with the white pants, and they looked amazing. And I told Steve Bast's son, Steve, that, your dad made baby blue look really beautiful, because when I saw Steve Bast wearing those baby blues like in 75, they were just amazing. And he was just really looked good in those leathers. And Mike Bast just continued to tear up the 1970s. And he just, was nonstop. I mean, that guy was just good. He just continued to dominate and rule the world of Speedway in the 70s. And Mike Bast was here's the 75 program of the United States Championship. A lot of people went, that was at the LA Coliseum. Mike Bast was just completely amazing. And he won the 1975 United States Speedway Championship. And he just continued to dominate the 70s. There was nobody so good as Michael Bast. They said that he was like a computer brain. I mean, Mike Bast, he went ahead and he rode like he was a computer. People just asked, like, how could you be so good? And it was because he was focused. Michael Bast took extraordinary effort into focusing his speedway so that he could actually dominate the 70s. Michael Bast dominated because of his brain, and they called him like a computer brain because he was so exact and so perfect. It was just, no one's ever seen a rider like Michael Bast ever in the world of Speedway. He was just a gifted and talented rider. Michael Bast was truly one of the greatest legends of all time in American Speedway history. He was just really good. And here's another legend, Sonny Nutter. Do you remember Sliding Sonny Nutter? He was good. And he was actually in the Whiteman Stadium. He was a senior rider. And he was really famous at the beginning of Speedway up until the mid-70s. And Sonny Nutter made a lot of money, bought a house. And here's a picture with Mike and Sonny Nutter and Steve Bast. These guys were all highly talented riders in the 70s. They were just good riders. And Sliding Sonny was a senior. Here's his brother Steve in the 75 program. He had won that United States Championship in 74. And I thought Steve was going to win back-to-back. But his brother Mike went ahead and took the bacon home that year. So that was pretty cool. And then Mike had a lot of sponsorships. He had many. He was making money. I mean, the guy was famous. And he was sponsored by Bell Helmets with Wild Bill Cody and a list of other Speedway stars. Mike Bast was really doing well. And then back in the late 70s, they had this thing called team racing. And he was picked to race on the Los Angeles Sprockets of the National Speedway League. Mike Bast was probably the first pick ever in that Speedway. Because if I was picking a Speedway team, guess who my first pick would be in the Speedway League? It would be this guy here, Michael Bast. I mean, Sliding Michael Bast was good, and he led the team with over 13 points in that Speedway League, the first and only National League Speedway League. And also on that team was the legendary Bruce the Fox Penhall. Bruce Penhall was an amazing rider, and he was probably number 2 pick at that time. And they had Gene Woods also, so that was a pretty good team if you have Bast, Penhall, and Woods. I'd say that team was a top team, and it was number 2 for the year, so that wasn't bad. And Bast, like I said, he had an average of over 13 points, and they only raced 4 races, so that was really, truly amazing how Michael Bast went ahead and scored so many points. And he just was here he is riding for the LA Sprockets. he was a pole rider. Mike Bast just loved to ride the pole. He was just really exceptionally talented, and he just continued to do well. And here he is sliding with his LA Sprockets uniform. I mean, that guy was just crazy. When he raced, he always raced the pole. So he would be like with Gene Woods, and Gene Woods is like an outside rider. So when Mike Bass and Gene Woods raced, Mike Bass would either take gate 1 or gate 2, depending on whether they had gate 1 or, so gate 1 and 3 or 2 and 4. So Mike Bass always took the pole, and Gene Woods would always take the outside, and they would team race. And Bruce Penhall said that that's how he learned how to team race, was through Michael Bass. And so Michael Bass, here's Michael Bass with Rob Morrison at the Irwindale Raceway. Rob Morrison was on the Los Angeles Sprockets. And actually, what a team. I can't believe. And then they had Bruce, the Fox Penhall, on that team. I mean, what a team that was. Bruce Penhall was on the show, and he said he learned a lot. He talked about Michael Bass, and he said a few things about the master. He was talking about Mike Bass, and here's Mike Bass talking and teaching Bruce Penhall about everything. Bruce Penhall, he was quoted as saying, Michael Bass is brilliant on everything he rode. He rode Speedway excellent, but he didn't just ride Speedway good. He rode dirt bikes, motocross, and road racing. I mean, Michael Bass was a talented guy, and Bruce Penhall saw the talent that Michael Bass had. And also Bruce Penhall went on to say, Mike probably was the best rider in American history as far as small tracks go. He taught me everything that I know. So Michael Bass was the teacher of Bruce the Fox Penhall. And Bruce learned everything he knew from who? Michael Bass. It was good. That guy was cool. And Bruce Penhall's fame kept growing, and Penhall kept winning those races. And he was the first American rider to win the world championship in 47 years. Bruce the Fox Penhall won back-to-back world championships in 1981 and 1982. Bruce Penhall was the first United States Speedway champion since the late, great Jack Milne. So that was just completely amazing. And Bruce Penhall credits his success to who? Michael Bass. So, I mean, when I talk to Bruce Penhall and we talk about Michael Bass, I could just see the respect and the allegiance and loyalty to the master, Michael Bass. I mean, Michael Bass was truly one of the amazing riders in U.S. Speedway history. And Penhall, when he was riding, he said, there's Bruce Penhall right there. He said that Mike Bass was about the only guy that I could not beat regularly. I mean, Michael Bass, he says, Bruce Penhall said, even when I came back from Europe, Michael Bass was my greatest threat. So Michael Bass was just a guy that just never stopped becoming good. And Michael Bass just, taught Bruce Penhall so much about Speedway. It's just amazing how much knowledge that Michael Bass learned. Bruce Penhall learned from Michael Bass, excuse me. And so that was just, and here's Bruce Penhall. He was just a famous rider. He learning how to ride. And this is a picture that I threw in for you. I don't like to talk about this guy too much, but here's Bruce shaking hands with Kenny Carter. I think Bruce Penhall and Kenny Carter were arch enemies. So when I saw these guys shaking hands, I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. That's one of the last times you're going to see them shaking hands. And so that was pretty cool. But like I say, Michael Bass won 6 United States. He won 7 in the 70s and 6 California state championships. So he was pretty amazing. And here's a program, actually in a program from a world qualifier in 78. And there's Michael Bass in the middle. And then I'm in the upper left-hand corner, sponsored by Vera's Leathers. And thank you, Bill Herbert. And they went ahead and sponsored us at Vera's Leathers. And there was Jim, the animal fishback, Mike Crisco, and Bill Herbert. And we were on the program. Actually, we're in the advertisement in the World Qualifier. And my first race in the World Qualifier, when Michael Bast was a United States champion, he was unbeatable at this time. And he won 5 United States championships in the late 70s. And in 78, I raced Michael Bast. And here he is in one of the races. My first race in the World Qualifier, and with 3 points and the victory. Who won? Michael Bast. And who was second place? Me, Brian the Bumblebee. So Michael Bast, he went ahead and he was good. He actually raced at a track I was doing really good at, so I thought I could beat Mike Bast, but Mike Bast just got the gate and he was gone. I mean, he had eyes in the back of his head and he was hard to beat. And so that was really cool. Michael was just, I just thought there's no way he could beat me, but he beat me. And Michael Bast just showed me who was the master. And Michael Bast was truly just incredible. And he just won everything. And he was just really good. And he just continued to race, continued to win. Michael Bast won over 4,000 speedway races in his career. Can you imagine that? 4,000! Most guys would be happy with like 5 or 10 main events or races. And Mike Bast won 4,000. I can just imagine what his trophy room looks like in his house. I think Michael Bast built a house just for his trophies. There's so many. And in his 18 years, it was just crazy at how much Michael went ahead and, won. He just was winning everything. And he had eyes in the back of his head. And Mike Bast was the master. He was truly the master of Speedway. And here he is with a great Ivan Major back in like the 70s. These guys hung out. They hung out like in the early 70s. And it looks like around the late 70s or early 80s or something, Michael Bast was also being tutored and helping out by the Ivan Major. And Michael Bast, he went ahead and he helped a lot of people too. And he said the difference between me and other riders was the details, Mike Bast said. He said, I was overwhelmingly focused and too focused. I knew every intricate detail possible. That's why I won lots of races. I put a lot more into it than most people. It was that one little bit that the next guy didn't do that made the difference. Now, what a difference did it make? That was just crazy. And here's Mike with the Moran brothers and with Gene Woods. They hung out. Actually, Gene Woods and Mike Bast are good friends today. And Brad Oxley said that no one was as smooth as Michael Bast on the racetrack or as consistent as Michael Bast. And the sport is truly unpredictable, Brad Oxley said. And here comes this guy who was totally predictable as a Rolex watch. And that was Michael Bast. He was just the master. I mean, here he is with Kelly Moran. When Michael Bast speaks, you better listen. You better listen if Michael Bast tells you. But Michael Bast wasn't perfect. I mean, we all crash at Speedway, and I never thought Michael Bast could crash. But this legendary classic picture is a fun picture of Michael Bast crashing. Look at that. I mean, even when Michael Bast crashes, he does it in style. I mean, nobody crashed as nice as Michael Bast. Nobody raced Speedway as good as Michael Bast. Michael Bast did everything good. And Michael Bast was truly the dominant force of Speedway in his 18 years of riding. I mean, that guy was just good. He just knew how to ride. And he was a coach. He mentored many Speedway riders. He knew how to groom the track. Michael Bast would just know how to get ready for the starts. Nobody really started better than Michael Bast. And once Michael Bast got in the lead, good luck. You're not going to beat that guy. And look at him. He's grooming. I think he taught Charlie the Edge Venegas how to do that. because every time Charlie gets to the line, he does what? He grooms that track. And there's Michael Bast grooming that track. And he talked to a lot of the good riders. There's Kelly Moran. He's giving lots of coaches tips to Kelly Moran. And he was an inspiration to so many people, not only Bruce Penhall. And there he is as one of the winners. He won so many main events, we stopped counting them. And Michael Bast was just a tough rider. Here he was with Alan Crazy Christian. Can you say Alan Crazy Christian? Alan Crazy Christian was a pole rider, if you remember. And we all raced against Alan, and he would push you out. And here's Michael Bast pushing Alan Crazy Christian out. Michael Bast was a pole rider, and Alan Crazy Christian was a pole rider. So you have two alpha male pole riders going for one pole. And Michael Bast was just crazy. If you push Alan Crazy Christian out, you're a good rider. That's all I can say. And then here is Michael Bast. Looks like he's beating Gene Woods and a few other guys. I mean, who did Michael Bast not beat? He beat everyone. Michael Bast was truly a legend, and he just never stopped winning those speedway races. He was just a really great rider. Michael Bast just showed everybody who was the boss. Hey, here's Gene Woods leading Michael Bast. Gene Woods is probably like, I beat Michael Bast, because if you beat Michael Bast, you really had beat a good guy. And Michael Bast was really hard to beat. And that's you want that picture on your wall. Anytime you can beat Michael Bast, you really want to show that off. So that was good. So Michael Bast, he raced till the mid 70s, or 80s, excuse me. Here's Bebop. Say hi. She's going to say hi. Hi. She likes everybody, so she's very sweet. She came and visited you in the hive. So yeah, she's eating. Look at that. She doesn't even chew with her mouth closed. She chews like a cow, like unk. She's cool. And so Michael Bast actually had this illustrious career, and he retired in the mid 80s. He just got, he got tired after 18 years, and he was used to making that big money in the 70s. And then, like I just briefly mentioned, the Speedway had a change when Harry Oxley went ahead and cut the SRA. And then Michael Bast started losing a lot of money because, it really pissed Michael off, because he was cleaning a house. And people were booing Michael Bast because Michael Bast won so many races that it really made people mad. And I remember sitting in the stands at Costa Mesa, and everybody was booing Michael Bast because they wanted to see somebody new winning. But Michael Bast would not allow it. Michael Bast was winning all the main events, and he just continued to dominate the 70s. And I was reading that Michael Bast, he went ahead and went home, and he was really sad that, I felt sad too if people boo me. And actually, I read an article that Michael Bast, he actually cried when he went home one day that people didn't like him so much. So Michael Bast has a heart, and he's a great guy. And he felt very sad that people really didn't like him. And he just completely dominated the 70s. And actually, Michael Bast and Steve Bast became like the villains of Speedway at that time. Of course, now we honor Michael, and we love Michael. But he was like a villain, and he did not do interviews. Steve Bast, they stayed away from people. Steve and Mike Bast were to themselves. And that's why he won so many races too, because Steve Bast and Mike Bast were focused on the Speedway. They didn't get into Speedway for the fans and waving to people and signing autographs. They were focused champions, both of the brothers. And it kind of created a negative image in a way, because people would see like Sliding Sunny Nutter, Danny Becker, Rick Woods, and a lot of these guys who were more like personable, who met the people. And then you see the Bast brothers, they were kind of like villains to a lot of people because they didn't like socialize with the people. Why? Because they were focused on winning the races. So that was kind of how that worked back in the 70s. And then they had that Speedway strike. Mike Bast was the leader of the Speedway strike. And I actually had to go on that strike too, because my tuner, which was Dub Farrell's tuner, Jerry Fairchild, he was the president of the SRA. So we had to go and do the strike, and it was really tough. And it lasted a few weeks. Larry Huffman, I think, was in that strike. He was on the show. And it just, Speedway changed. The glory days of Speedway actually changed. And the money changed also. And so Mike Bast was told by Harry Oxley, you got to keep racing the handicap races. And the money in Speedway was really in the scratch main event. And that's the area that Mike Bast was focusing on in the late 70s. And Mike Bast came up to Harry and said to Harry, I don't want to race the handicap. I just want to race the scratch. And Harry said, no, you will race the handicap racing. And Mike Bast, he said, no, it's too dangerous. There's a lot of bad riders like me and other riders, low yardage riders, that could crash him. Although I would never crash Michael Bast. I would be ashamed of myself if I did that. But other riders would do that. And Mike Bast said, I don't want to ride handicap because there's no money and it's dangerous. I could actually get hurt riding that. So he went ahead and he told Harry Oxley, no, he didn't want to do that. And so anyways, Harry Oxley went ahead and told Michael Bast, if you don't race the handicap, I'm taking you off the program. So Michael Bast went ahead and said, okay. And I think Michael Bast actually raced the handicap semi half-heartedly because the money wasn't there anymore. And he did not want to Michael Bast was always thinking with his head. And later, in Michael's older years, he said that maybe Harry Oxley was right. And he kind of backed down on his stance with Harry Oxley. But Michael Bast understood as he got more mature and older, about everything, that he should have continued to race. But Michael Bast just completely had this career that was second to none. And he just won all those races, over 4,000 races. That's a lot. And Michael Bast just retired. He hung up his steel shoe and he never raced Speedway again in the mid 80s. I think everybody was happy that Michael Bast hung up his steel shoe, because I'm sure when Mike Bast retired, he was a young guy and he could still win main events. So that was one less competitor and champion that these guys didn't have to race. So probably a lot of these guys were really happy. So Mike Bast retired from the sport of Speedway, and the next chapter of his life was the final chapter of Michael Bast. Michael Bast, like I say, is an amazing human being. This was a vlog I did. I did a 4-part series on Michael Bast. And this is the final chapter, the thumbnail of that blog. Michael Bast, he actually watched all 4 parts of this particular video on my YouTube channel, Brian B. And he gave it thumbs up with his wife, Dee. So thank you so much. I hope Michael Bast is watching today, because I talked to his wife and I said, watch this show. And we'd love to, like I say, have him watch this show, because this show is for Michael Bast and it's for you. Michael Bast was an amazing rider. And then also he had a son. He had actually 2 sons and a daughter. He had Ryan Bast. Shane Bast was his other son. And he had Kari, his daughter. So he had 2 sons and a daughter. And Michael Bast was a good father and a really good coach. Here he is with his son, Ryan, who had recently retired from the sport. He raced several years Speedway. And Ryan was actually a pretty good D1 rider. He won a lot of main events. He won some main events. And he actually won that 25-lap race over at Fast Fridays. Ryan Bast basically rode mostly at the Fast Fridays in Northern California, because they lived 5 minutes or so from the track. So it was really easy for them. And Ryan rode a few times down south also. But mostly Ryan Bast, he actually rode in Northern California. And he was a good rider. I mean, this guy was solid. Here he is with a main event trophy. and he could ride. He had Papa's ability, although he didn't race 18 years, maybe a few. I mean, when you're following the footsteps of Michael Bast, I mean, that's hard. I mean, if I had to follow Michael Bast and be his son, that would be a lot of pressure, and it would be impossible to win 4,000 speedway races and to win 7 United States championships in a decade. So, I mean, how can you do that? That's like no success. But Ryan Bast was a hard charger. There he is, Ryan, crossing up. That guy could ride. Look at that guy. He's popping a Dennis Sigalos wheelie in the turn. So he was just a quality rider, and he was just good. And Michael Bast just really was just a great, individual all around. He was a good dad. Mike Bast really loved his children, and he cared. He had a child who was in Little League one time, and Mike Bast was the Little League coach. He went ahead and donated his services to coach baseball. And he was teaching these kids all these things that he learned while he was a speedway rider. He taught the kids, like the pitcher. His son played, I think, center field. And then Mike Bast, he taught the kids things like the pitcher. He would say, it doesn't matter how fast you throw the ball. It matters where you put the ball, the placement of the ball. And Michael Bast always did his planning like that. He always taught people how to use their brain and how to use their head. And Michael Bast was truly a legend on and off the speedway track. He was just everybody liked Michael Bast, including, here's Greg Herbie Grin Hancock. Greg Hancock was a 4-time world champion, and he really probably learned a little bit from Michael Bast. If I was Greg, I would pick Mike Bast's brains, and I'm sure that Greg Hancock went ahead and maybe learned something. And Greg Hancock also was hanging out a lot and all over the place. And then Mike Bast also was at Fast Fridays with the legendary Billy the Kid Gennaro. Although Billy is not a kid no more, he's kind of old, but there's Mike Bast and Billy the Kid Gennaro. And with Billy's number one, he won a lot of championships, Billy Gennaro. Truly another legend in the speedway world. But I think nobody can compare with the master Mike Bast. There's Ryan Bast, and looks like Kari, his daughter, with a plaque that Mike Bast went ahead and earned and got at a racetrack. It looks like around the same night. But Mike Bast was truly an amazing individual, amazing writer, and he was a family man. One of Mike Bast's really cool things about him is he's been married to his wife for over close to 50 years now. I don't know about over, but he was a family man. Mike Bast has this really great family. He loves his family. And actually, a few years ago, in 2014, I think it was, he went ahead and he had a stroke, and he almost died. And he went ahead and recovered from it. He had to have some therapy, and he actually just had to kind of relearn how to do the motor skills. Unfortunately, Mike Bast can't ride motorcycles no more because he has a little bit of vertigo, and he can't do that anymore. But Mike Bast just totally is in the hearts, and he's a champion of all the people, and he just completely was one of the greatest riders of all time. And then 2016, he won the Trailblazers Award of the Hall of Fame, and he was probably in the AMA Hall of Fame also, because Mike Bast deserves to be in every Hall of Fame of motorsports. I mean, he was that good, and he was just one of the greatest riders. And in 2007 and 2008, the bubble burst, and Michael Bast had a lot of houses and stuff, and things got really bad with the houses, and the market went really bad, and things kind of turned bad for him with losing some of the houses. And then he had to go to work for the construction company that he started. And then he had that stroke around 2014 or 15, and it was really devastated for his life and for his family, his poor family. And Mike Bast has an amazing family. There's his family right there. And he has, especially behind every good man is what? It's a good woman for sure. If you're a good man, you got to have a good woman. And there is Dee, his wife. She's been with him for all those years. And there's Mike holding a picture of Dee, and Dee holding a picture of Mike. So that's cool. They've been lovebirds. Dee has helped Mike through the difficult times. Mike has been there with Dee through his whole life as an adult, winning all that money. Mike was a good investor. He went ahead and did a lot of investing. And Mike went ahead and came a long way from his early days as a young boy. Mike Bast was a handsome young boy, and he was a handsome writer too. And he just was a great writer. And he just went ahead and was destined for greatness with his brother Steve Bast. And they won those trophies as young 13-year-old kids. They knew how to. God gave these guys a gift. I mean, these guys didn't really have to learn it. They developed their gift, and they went ahead and were just truly some of the most amazing writers in United States history. Mike Bast and Steve Bast were really great champions. And Mike Bast was inducted to the Hot Shoe Hall of Fame. Gene Woods runs the Hot Shoe Hall of Fame in Las Vegas, Nevada. And this past year, Mike Bast he donated his steel shoe for the Hall of Fame. And it's hanging up there. If you want to go see it, it's in Las Vegas at the Hot Shoe Hall of Fame. Gene Woods runs that at the track there. So Mike Bast has won all kinds of honors. Mike Bast was in Las Vegas last week, and he was hanging out with Gene Woods. And I asked Gene if he would come on my show, but he didn't say anything. But we talked to his wife, Dee, and she said, maybe Mike will give you 5 minutes, but maybe 5 minutes. Mike doesn't do interviews, so we appreciate that if Mike can give us a couple minutes, because we would certainly love to talk to the legend, Michael Bast. And Michael Bast is truly number one in our hearts. He had number one on his helmet for almost the whole decade of the 70s. I mean, that guy was good. He was just a complete legend of Speedway, and he was just one of the greatest short track riders ever in United States history. And he had this brain that was like a computer. Some people say that Michael Bast, he was the early day computer. Before the computers was Michael Bast. And I think one of the writers said they want to open up Michael's brains and see all the computer wires, because his brain worked like a computer. He was methodical. He was thinking. He planned everything out. He was no nonsense. Michael Bast was a true champion. And he did that because he focused his ability, his efforts on his racing. Mike Bast probably studied all of his riders. He knew the tendency. He knew how to beat people. He knew where to go. Michael Bast had eyes in the back of his head, like the 17-year veteran Ole Olsen had eyes in the back of his head. Michael Bast and Ole Olsen were like Bopsy twins because they were so good. They actually knew where all the riders were. They knew how to beat these guys, and he just had it. God gives a gift to people, and Michael Bast had this gift. And it was just amazing, the gift that Michael Bast had. Mike Bast was the true champion of the 70s, winning 70% of the United States Speedway Championships at the 70s, 7 out of 10. And then you had Steve Bast winning in 74. So that's 8 out of 10 championship races from the Bast brothers. And Michael Bast won 7 of those championships. So that was just crazy. You will never see a brother team or a single guy win 7 United States championships in one decade. But you saw Mike Faria in the 90s winning 3. And that's really great. Mike Faria was unbeatable in the 90s, just an amazing rider. And Steve Bast won 7. That's just, that'll never happen. As long as Speedway is here, you'll never see one rider win 7 Speedway titles in one decade. That's just impossible. And Michael Bast did it. So we should really honor and respect the memory and the legend of Michael Bast forever, because Michael Bast is a forever legend. I mean, this guy will never be forgotten. And we should never forget the greatness of Michael Bast. Bruce Penhall calls him Mike Fast Bast because he was fast. But more than fast, he was a genius. And Mike Bast, he invented computers before they invented computers. Why? Because he thought like a computer. Michael Bast was just one of the most incredible talents in Speedway history. He really was that good. And I don't think there's ever going to be another Michael Bast, because there's just one Mike Bast. And he tutored the great Bruce Penhall when they were racing on the sprockets. Bruce Penhall went on to greatness because of Michael Bast's teachings. And I would have liked to be taught by Michael Bast. That would have been just amazing. But Bruce Penhall and Gene Woods were taught by Michael Bast. Michael Bast was a good guy. He would freely talk to his teammates. He would give them suggestions. He would help people. Bruce Penhall was telling me back in the 70s that Michael Bast would always freely give him information when Bruce Penhall was a young Speedway rider. A lot of the Speedway riders, they didn't like to divulge information to young riders like Bruce Penhall and others, because they didn't want to give their secrets away. Like they didn't want to tell how to beat him. But Michael Bast was such a good individual. He would tell the riders, his friends, what to do and how to win and stuff like that. Mike Bast, he was not selfish like most of the guys. They weren't very nice. And I raced a couple years in D1, and they never would say nice things or give me secrets. But Mike Bast was a good spirit and a good human being, and he would teach and he would tutor the younger riders like Bruce Penhall and others how to race and how to win at Speedway. Mike Bast would impart his knowledge to help these people race and win Speedway. So, Mike Bast was a great rider. There's no doubt. He goes down as really one of the all-time legends of American Speedway. If you talk about American Speedway, the legends, Mike Bast has to be at the very top of that list. And more than just a legend on the Speedway track, which he was a legend as far as being a good human being. He was a nice guy. He was in good shape. He took care of himself. Michael Bast did not go partying like everybody. In the 70s, that was the era of party. Some of the riders, I won't mention that some of the riders, I know, they came to the Speedway races on high on either alcohol or marijuana. These guys would race drugged up. But Michael Bast never did that. He was focused. He was a professional. And Michael Bast was a champion. And that's what set him apart. He didn't go partying like everyone. And he focused on winning championships. He focused on beating his competitors. And he focused. Michael Bast was just truly just a focused individual. And that's what, we have a lot of young riders on the show. And that's why I tell them that, you got to focus on this. And if you could focus as much as Michael Bast focused, you would be a really, really good rider. So Michael Bast just went ahead and dominated the 70s. And he was just an amazing human being. And he fought, the difficulties. He was up very high, made lots of money. He had his stroke, he went down. And Michael Bast just continues to be a good human being. He's actually doing well today. I talked to his wife, Dee, and she said Michael is doing a lot of, good things. He's functioning really good after his stroke. And Michael Bast is a true champion. So would you expect anything less than championship quality from a championship human being like Michael Bast? I don't think so. And Michael Bast just continued to win, to do good things. And he just, Michael Bast is just really one of the true champions of the Speedway. He dominated the 70s. Michael Bast just continued to like beat everybody up. I mean, nobody could beat Michael Bast. Like I said, even Bruce Penhall said that Michael Bast was difficult. And he was the guy that could always give Mike Bast a run for his money. He could give Bruce Penhall a run for his money because Mike Bast was just truly an amazing champion. And he just continued to like blow people away. And he just was good. He started out at the Whiteman Stadium in Pacoima, California, on that racetrack that was like a next to the hangar where they had the races. And Mike Bast saw this poster of Sammy Tanner, the great Sammy Tanner, who won over 400 races at the Ascot Park. He was one of the famous TT riders in American history, Sammy Tanner. Mike Bast saw that poster and said, hey, let's go to the races. And Mike Bast, he won lots of trophies as a young boy. He was talented, and he just continued to progress with his brother Steve and win championships. He had great rivals with Rick Woods. Rick the Rocket Woods. Rick Woods was the Rocket. And they had lots of different competitive races. And Mike Bast just showed everyone that he was the master of the 70s. And he was a master of the 80s. Whenever Mike Bast got on a bike, he could ride. He even like rode with James Caan and did the stunt work. He just jumped on a trials bike and he said, let me go for it. And he made a perfect first take. I mean, Mike Bast could do everything. Bruce Penhall, like he said, he could ride motocross. He could ride road racing. He could ride anything. Michael Bast could get on everything, not just a speedway bike. He was talented. But nowadays, Michael doesn't ride speedway bikes, and he doesn't drive much because of his stroke. But Michael Bast was truly one of the greatest riders of all time. And he was posed with Sonny Nutter back in the 70s. Sonny Nutter was riding for KEZY radio. Do you remember KEZY? I used to listen to that radio station all the time, and it was cool. Sonny Nutter was he was the first handsome guy at Speedway, and that's kind of a cool picture with this popular Sonny Nutter, fan favorite, Mr. Handsome, and he's with the famous Bast brothers there. And then Steve Bast was one of the true legends of Speedway, his brother. He passed away, rest in peace. Steve Bast, just a true legend. And just Mike Bast just had it, Some guys just have that gift. And, like if you look at basketball, you see like Kobe Bryant, he was one of the greatest basketball players of all time. And then you look at Mike Bast, and he just had it. Steve Bast was really ferocious, this guy, his brother. Steve Bast was not the computer brain that Mike Bast was, but Steve Bast had an amazing hunger. I saw Steve Bast when I was a little kid, and he scared me, to be honest with you, because he was like growling before the races. He was very into it. Steve Bast was very emotional, and Steve Bast was a super amazing rider. But Steve Bast was not the computer brain that Mike Bast was, because Mike Bast was very methodical. He was kind of calm, and he just was like a computer. Mike Bast and Steve Bast was kind of emotional, and he was a hard charger, and he was very ferocious. And I was scared when I saw Steve Bast. I'm like, I wouldn't want to ride against Steve. He was truly a great rider, though. When Steve Bast was on, nobody could beat you. I mean, nobody could beat Steve Bast because that guy was fast. Even Mike Bast, when Steve Bast was winning or he was on that night, I mean, good luck. Nobody could really beat that guy. So Steve Bast was also an amazing rider with his brother Mike. But Mike Bast, he had that brain, and that's really what set him apart from possibly all the riders, including his brother and every rider. Because Mike Bast, he really had that brain set, that set of a champion. And he didn't ride emotional like Steve. Mike Bast rode calculating. He was like a machine. He totally was functioning very methodical, and he just was really unbelievable talent. And he was truly one of the greatest riders in Speedway history. He had total dominance of the 70s. So he was just really crazy. Mike Bass, he was just one of the greatest riders of all time, Michael Bass. So that's a little bit about the Michael Bass. We got some comments here. Sunny from Denmark said hello, and Tata said hello, famous Brian. And Larry Shaw, Lightning Larry Shaw, is watching from the Facebook. So we want to welcome Larry Shaw. He's actually married to, I think, or was married or married, I'm not sure the date, but was married to Michael Bass' sister and Steve Bast. So we have Lightning Larry Shaw in the hive tonight. And we have Susie watching from Cavite, Philippines. And then we have EGOT TV supporting from Alcatraz TV. We have Gene Woods and Rick on the outside. Rick Woods didn't ride the outside very much, did he, Gene? Rick Woods was a pole rider. We know that Rick Woods, he rode the pole. And you, Gene Woods, you were an outside rider. Gene Woods was an amazing outside rider. Like I said in the show when they did the team racing, Gene Woods was on the Los Angeles Sprockets. And when he teamed up with Mike Bass, what a luck. Gene Woods, I don't like you no more. I mean, you got to ride with Mike Bass. I mean, what a lucky guy. I'm envious of Gene Woods. Like, I'm pissed off because, I mean, I would like to ride with Mike Bass. Can you imagine that if you're teamed up with Mike Bass? I mean, that's cool. And so you had Mike Bass as a major pole rider. And Mike Bass, I was a pole rider too. And Mike Bass was a great pole rider. And he didn't ride the outside very much. But Gene Woods was a great outside rider. And he could ride the pole also. So when they teamed up on the LA Sprockets, Mike Bass would say, Gene, you take the outside gate and I take the inside gate. So that was cool. So Mike Bass had gate 1 and 3, and Gene Woods had 3. Or Mike Bass had gate 2, and then Gene Woods had gate 4 when they team raced. And so that was cool. And they were just amazing riders. And they just were really, really good. So we have Rick from Facebook. How you doing, bud? And we have Denmark in the house with Sunny. So we have lots of you guys from all over the United States. Thank you so much for your comments. Appreciate it. And like I say, we honor and respect Michael Bass. I did a 4-part series on Michael Bass. I mean, nobody had Michael Bass on YouTube. And he's written very little on the internet, really. I mean, for as great as he is, I was shocked. And one guy, he actually was a neighbor of Mike Bass in Northern California. He wrote me and he said, oh my gosh, thank you so much for making the video on Michael Bass. And I said, why? What's the big deal? And he said that Michael Bass is hard to find on YouTube and stuff. And you have made lots of videos on Michael Bass. And YouTube goes ahead on search engine, puts my videos up front, promotes them. Because nobody promotes Michael Bass. It's just amazing. I mean, somebody as good as Michael Bass doesn't get promoted. So we're really honored to do that for Michael Bass. So thank you so much for watching the show, The Michael Bass Show, total dominance of the 70s and the 80s. Michael Bass started in 68 at the Whiteman Stadium and finished in 85. Probably at Costa Mesa Speedway. He hung up his still shoe, and he never raced no more. But he went on to have a good life, to teach his kids, to coach his son, the Speedway, and he had his ups and downs like all of us have. But Michael Bass is a true champion, and we're so grateful that we could talk about the legend, Michael Bass. Michael Bass will be forever the legend in American Speedway history. So we thank you so much for watching. We have a lot of guests lining up to come on the show, and we've got this new system here we're excited about, and we'd like to have Lightning Larry Shaw on the show if he can make it one of these days, and we'd like to have some promoters. I think we'd like to have a show with all those Speedway promoters. Wouldn't that be cool? We had a show with to find out what's going on with Speedway this year. We have Kelly Inman, Dave Joyner. It'd be cool to have Brad Oxley, Steve Evans, and just have a roundtable Speedway chat about what's happening, because we're already starting the month of February here in 2021, and we would really like to go ahead and have the Speedway going on this year, and to know what's happening with the Speedway. And Rick said that Mike Bast always dominated here in Bakersfield. Oh God, he was good when he raced the Bakersfield Bandits. I bet he won a lot of races for the LA Sprockets. And when he was just a scratch or handicap rider, and Mike Bast was truly amazing. Mike Bast, he won at Bakersfield all the time. And then Mike Bast won at Irwindale all the time. And then Mike Bast won at Costa Mesa all the time. And then Mike Bast won at San Bernardino all the time. And then Mike Bast won at Ventura all the time. Mike Bast dominated everywhere. I mean, there wasn't a track. I mean, he was rich. Michael Bast, he was one of the richest Speedway riders, I think, of all time in American history. We don't talk about that, but it's true. Michael Bast just cleaned house, and he just made a lot of money. We wish today we could make as much money as Michael Bast made in the 70s. We would be very rich. So anyway, so that was cool. But thank you so much for watching the live stream today. We talked about Michael Bast and his legacy. And if you want to go ahead and watch more videos, it's on the YouTube channel, Brian B. I have some really cool. Watch the Mike Bast series. It's really cool. And then there's other Speedways of all the different riders. And we like to, have you come and join the channel, join the family. And we're going to do more live streams soon. So thank you. We do them like daily, actually. And I don't know, maybe you're sick of these, but I like them. It's fun. And actually, we want to preserve the Speedway history. The reason why we do this is we want to educate the people of the history. We talked about early day American Speedway, Speedway in 1968 at the Whiteman Stadium, 1969, the revival of Speedway at the Costa Mesa Fairgrounds, and we're talking today about the legend Mike Bast. So we want to go ahead and preserve the Speedway history and also educate and give you guys value, like to teach you guys more about the Speedway, the American Speedway history. It was really great. So that was kind of the reason why we do the show, is we want to preserve the history, and we want to educate and give value to you, the people watching. And we really appreciate it, because we know that you're out there, and there's lots of people watching the show right now. And thank you so much for tuning in. We had a great time today talking about the legend Mike Bast. I mean, you can't stop talking about him. I mean, he's just, he's the master. I mean, if Bruce Penhall bows down to you, you're really good. And Bruce Penhall pretty much bows to Michael Bast, because everybody should do that, because he is truly one of the legends of all-time legends of Speedway in America. And like I say, Bruce Penhall said that Michael Bast was the greatest short track rider of all time. So this guy was good. I mean, the best. The best was Bast. So we go ahead and appreciate it. And we go ahead and wish you good health, Michael. And we wish you a long life. And we just look forward to hopefully meeting with you here on the show. We'd love to have 5 minutes if we could, because we just are honored for this, for you, and just amazing talent. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today in the Beehive. And we had a fun show talking about the master, Michael Bast. So thanks again for your time, and we're going to do a show probably tomorrow. We'll think about what we're going to do, but we'll have a good show. And thank you once again for joining us in the Beehive. Ride safe, stay on two wheels, and we'll see you next race.